In the pristine coastal town where million-dollar homes overlook the Pacific, Vivian Thorne appeared to have died peacefully at her desk. But when Detective Marcus Reed discovered that her business partner could lie as naturally as he breathed, a simple heart attack became the most dangerous game of deception he'd ever encountered. One man's greatest weapon would ultimately become his fatal weakness, and it would take just 7 words to expose a killer who thought he was untouchable. The morning fog rolled in from Monterey Bay like a gray shroud, obscuring the fairy tale cottages of Carmel by the Sea in an ethereal mist. At 6:47 a.m., the serenity of Scenic Road was shattered by the wail of sirens echoing off the cypress trees that lined the coastal bluffs. Detective Marcus Reed pulled his unmarked sedan behind the patrol cars, already crowding the driveway of a sprawling Tudor-style mansion. The house stood like a fortress against the cliff, its leaded glass windows reflecting the churning Pacific below. Even in the dim morning light, Reed could see this was serious money, the kind that bought privacy, influence, and usually immunity from the messier aspects of life. The patrol officer who met him at the front door was young, probably fresh out of the academy, but his face carried the weight of someone who'd just seen something that didn't sit right. "Detective Reed, I'm Officer Martinez. We've got what appears to be a natural death, but..." He paused, searching for the right words. Something feels off about the whole thing. Reed followed Martinez through a foyer that could have housed his entire apartment. Oil paintings in gilded frames lined the walls, and a crystal chandelier cast prismatic rainbows across marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. The house was silent, except for the measured tick of an antique grandfather clock and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. Victim is Vivian Thorne, age 42, tech entrepreneur. Martinez continued as they walked down a hallway lined with awards and photographs, showing a striking woman with intelligent dark eyes shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. Found dead in her home office around 6 a.m. by her business partner. Initial assessment suggests cardiac arrest. They stopped outside a heavy oak door marked with crime scene tape. Through the doorway, Reed could see into a spacious office where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the ocean. But it was the scene at the mahogany desk that commanded his attention. Vivian Thorne sat slumped forward in her leather chair, her head resting on a stack of financial documents. Her long black hair cascaded across papers covered in neat handwriting and precise calculations. She wore an expensive silk blouse and pearl earrings. Even in death, she looked like she belonged in the boardroom of a Fortune 500 company. Reed circled the desk slowly, his trained eye cataloging every detail. A half-empty cup of coffee sat cooling beside her right hand. Her laptop was still open, the screen displaying a complex spreadsheet. Everything suggested a woman who had simply worked too late and paid the ultimate price for her dedication. But something nagged at him. The office was too perfect, too clean. Not a single paper was out of place, despite what should have been Vivian's final moments of distress. Her reading glasses sat folded neatly beside the laptop, not askew as they would be if she'd suddenly clutched her chest in pain. Most telling of all, her coffee cup sat precisely centered on its coaster, without a single drop spilled. "Where's the partner who found her?" Reed asked, pulling out his notebook. "Adrian Cross. He's in the living room, pretty shaken up. Says he came by around 6 a.m. for an early meeting and found the front door unlocked. When she didn't answer his calls, he came looking and found her like this." Reed nodded, but his attention remained fixed on the scene. In 23 years of police work, he'd learned to trust his instincts. And right now, every instinct screamed that this picture-perfect death was anything but natural. He bent closer to examine Vivian's face. Her skin had the waxy pallor of death, but her expression was strangely peaceful, not contorted with the agony typically associated with a massive heart attack. Her lips showed no signs of cyanosis, the blue tinge that usually accompanied cardiac distress. "Has anyone touched anything in here?" he asked Martinez. "Cross says he checked for a pulse, but other than that, nothing's been disturbed. We secured the scene as soon as we arrived." Reed stood and surveyed the room once more. On the surface, everything pointed to a tragic but natural death. A successful woman working herself to death, literally. It happened more often than people like to admit, especially in high-pressure industries like tech. But the details that bothered him were adding up. The pristine coffee cup, the perfectly arranged papers, the unlocked front door in a neighborhood where security was paramount, and something else, a faint, sweet smell that seemed out of place in the masculine, leather-bound office. I want this treated as a potential crime scene, Reed told Martinez. Get the medical examiner down here and make sure nobody else enters this room until I say so. You think someone killed her? Reed looked once more at Vivian Thorne's peaceful face, then at the pristine office that told a story too neat to be true. I think somebody wants us to believe she died naturally. In my experience, when a death scene looks this perfect, it usually means someone spent a lot of time making sure it would. As he prepared to interview Adrian Cross, Reed couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to meet someone who had answers for everything, perhaps too many answers. In the quiet luxury of the Carmel mansion, with the fog pressing against the windows like ghostly fingers, the detective sensed he was about to begin the most challenging case of his career. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, its deep resonance echoing through the house like a countdown. Time, Reed realized, would be everything in this investigation. Someone had used it carefully to create the perfect crime scene. Now he would use it to uncover the truth. Adrian Cross sat in the living room like a man bearing the weight of profound loss. He occupied the edge of a cream-colored sofa, his tall frame hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees as he stared at the Persian rug beneath his feet. When Detective Reed entered the room, Adrian looked up with eyes that seemed to hold a universe of grief. Mr. Cross? Reed extended his hand. I'm Detective Marcus Reed. I'm very sorry for your loss. Adrian rose to meet him, and Reed immediately understood why this man had been successful in business. Even in distress, Adrian possessed an almost magnetic presence. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Reed's monthly salary, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour and traumatic circumstances. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to command. Detective, thank you for coming so quickly. Adrian's handshake was firm, confident. I still can't believe she's gone. She was everything to our company, to everyone who knew her. Reed settled into the chair across from Adrian, his notebook ready. I understand you discovered the body this morning. Can you walk me through exactly what happened? Adrian took a deep breath, composing himself before he began. Vivian and I had scheduled a 6:30 a.m. meeting to review the quarterly projections before our board presentation today. It wasn't unusual. We often started early to avoid distractions. His voice caught slightly. When I arrived, I noticed the front door was unlocked, which immediately concerned me. Vivian was always meticulous about security. What time did you arrive? Exactly 6:15. I'm never late for meetings with Vivian. I called out when I entered, but there was no response. I assumed she was in her office, probably lost in her work as usual. Adrian's eyes grew distant. I knocked on her office door, then entered when she didn't answer. That's when I found her. Reed watched Adrian's face carefully as he spoke. Every detail flowed seamlessly. Each emotion appeared genuine. But something about the performance, and Reed was beginning to think of it as a performance, felt too polished. You checked for a pulse? Of course, I'm CPR certified. We both were, actually. Company policy after we lost an employee to a heart attack 3 years ago. Adrian's explanation came without hesitation, but I could tell immediately that she was gone. She was already cool to the touch. Did you move anything in the office? Nothing. I know better than to disturb a scene like that. I called 911 immediately and waited outside the room until the paramedics arrived. Reed made notes, impressed despite himself by Adrian's comprehensive responses. Most people in shock forgot details, stumbled over timelines, contradicted themselves. Adrian Cross had an answer for everything. Tell me about your business relationship with Ms. Thorne. For the first time, Adrian's composure cracked slightly. He ran a hand through his silver hair and looked toward the windows where the morning fog was beginning to lift. We were partners in every sense of the word. We founded Thorne Cross Technologies 7 years ago with nothing but an idea and unlimited ambition. Adrian stood and walked to a bookshelf, lined with industry awards and photographs. He picked up a framed picture of himself and Vivian at what appeared to be a company celebration, both smiling broadly as they held a crystal trophy. This was taken when we won the Innovation Award for our data encryption software. Vivian was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. She could see solutions to problems that hadn't even been identified yet. His voice grew warm with what seemed like genuine admiration. I handled the business side, the presentations, the networking. Vivian was the technical genius who made it all possible. Any recent business pressures? Financial difficulties? Adrian returned to his seat, and Reed noticed how smoothly he transitioned from emotional reminiscence to business facts. Actually, quite the opposite. We were in the middle of negotiations for a major acquisition. A Fortune 500 company wanted to buy us out for $500 million. Vivian had been working around the clock to prepare for the final presentations. That's a lot of money. Any disagreements about the sale? None whatsoever. We both saw it as the culmination of everything we'd worked for. Adrian leaned forward, his expression earnest. Detective, I need you to understand something. Vivian wasn't just my business partner, she was my closest friend. We trusted each other completely. If she had been having health issues, I would have known. Reed looked up from his notes. You're suggesting her death was unexpected? Completely. Vivian was in excellent health. She ran marathons, practiced yoga daily, had regular medical checkups. Her cardiologist just cleared her with a perfect bill of health 2 months ago. Adrian's voice grew stronger, more insistent. This doesn't make sense, detective. Healthy 42-year-old women don't just drop dead from heart attacks. There it was. The first crack in the perfect facade. Adrian Cross had just provided Reed with the very doubt that was nagging at him, but instead of feeling vindicated, Reed felt a chill of suspicion. Why would a grief-stricken partner immediately question the cause of death, unless he was trying to deflect attention from something else? Is there anyone who might have wanted to harm Ms. Thorne? Business rivals? Disgruntled employees? Adrian considered this carefully. The tech industry can be cutthroat, but I can't think of anyone who would resort to violence. Vivian was respected by everyone who worked with her. He paused, then added, though there have been some tensions recently. What kind of tensions? Our personal assistant, Elena Vasquez, has been acting strangely over the past few weeks. She seemed resentful about the acquisition, worried about her job security, and Vivian's sister, Judge Patricia Coleman, has been pressuring her to reconsider the sale. There was quite a heated argument between them last week. Reed made careful notes as Adrian provided detailed accounts of these conflicts, complete with dates, times, and specific conversations. Once again, his recall was remarkably precise for someone who claimed to be in shock. Mr. Cross, I have to ask, where were you last night between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. this morning? At home, preparing for today's presentation. I was on a conference call with our legal team until nearly midnight, then reviewed documents until about 2 a.m. I have phone records that can verify the call times. Adrian reached into his jacket and produced his phone. I can provide whatever information you need, detective. I want whoever did this caught as much as you do. As Reed wrapped up the initial interview, he found himself both impressed and disturbed by Adrian Cross. The man had an answer for every question, an explanation for every inconsistency. His grief seemed genuine, his cooperation complete. Yet something about the man's perfection set off every alarm bell in Reed's experienced mind. Walking back toward Vivian's office, Reed couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been masterfully manipulated. Adrian Cross was either the most helpful witness he'd ever encountered or the most dangerous suspect. Time would tell which. But one thing was certain: this investigation was about to become much more complicated than a simple case of natural death. 2 hours later, the mansion buzzed with controlled chaos. Crime scene technicians photographed every angle of Vivian's office, while Detective Reed interviewed the household staff in the sunlit breakfast nook overlooking the garden. The fog had lifted, revealing a crystalline day that seemed to mock the darkness of the investigation unfolding inside. Elena Vasquez sat across from Reed, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 28, she possessed the efficient demeanor of someone who had learned to anticipate her employer's every need, but today, that composure was fracturing under the weight of shock and something else Reed couldn't quite identify. Ms. Vasquez, how long have you worked for Ms. Thorne? 4 years this month. Elena's voice carried a slight Spanish accent that became more pronounced when she was nervous. I started as a temp and worked my way up to personal assistant. Vivian she was good to me, better than good. When did you last see her alive? Elena's eyes darted away from Reed's gaze. Yesterday evening around 7 p.m. She told me I could leave early because she wanted to work late on the presentation materials for today's board meeting. Did she seem upset about anything? Stressed beyond the normal business pressures? She'd been under tremendous pressure lately with the acquisition talks, but yesterday, Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. Yesterday she seemed almost relieved about something, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Reed leaned forward. Relieved about what? I don't know. She just seemed lighter somehow. She even smiled when she told me to go home. Early said she had some important decisions to make and needed quiet time to think. What about her relationship with Mr. Cross? Any recent tensions? Eleanor's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Adrian was always very charming. Too charming, if you ask me. But Vivian trusted him completely. Maybe too completely. What do you mean by that? Elena glanced toward the living room, where Adrian was still speaking with other officers. Look, Detective, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I handled Vivian's calendar, her emails, her finances. I saw things. What kind of things? Discrepancies. Money transfers that didn't match the explanations Adrian gave. Meetings he scheduled with clients that Vivian didn't know about. Small things, but they added up. Elena's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Last week, I found irregularities in our escrow account. Nearly $2 million that Adrian had moved without proper documentation. Reed's pulse quickened. Did you tell Ms. Thorne about this? I tried to, but Adrian was always there, always ready with an explanation. He made me feel like I was being paranoid, seeing problems where none existed. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. But yesterday, when Vivian seemed so relieved, I wondered if she'd finally discovered what I'd been trying to tell her. Where were you last night between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m.? At home with my boyfriend, Miguel. We had dinner and watched Netflix until around midnight, then went to bed. He can verify that. Reed made detailed notes, sensing he was finally getting closer to the truth. Elena's testimony painted a very different picture of the Thorne-Cross partnership than Adrian's version of perfect harmony. His phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Samuel Chen, the medical examiner. Preliminary results ready. You need to see this immediately. 20 minutes later, Reed stood in the county morgue's sterile examination room, staring down at Vivian Thorne's body under the harsh fluorescent lights. Dr. Chen, a meticulous man in his 50s who treated every case like a complex puzzle, pulled back the sheet covering the victim. Your instincts were right, Detective. This wasn't a natural death. Reed felt a grim satisfaction at having his suspicions confirmed, but also a chill at what this meant for the investigation. What did you find? Dr. Chen pointed to a small puncture mark on Vivian's neck, barely visible beneath her hairline. Injection site. Someone used a very fine needle, probably insulin syringe. And look at this. He showed Reed a close-up photograph of Vivian's fingernails. See the slight blue tinge? That's cyanosis, but not from cardiac arrest. This is consistent with digitalis poisoning. Digitalis. It's derived from foxglove plants. In therapeutic doses, it's used to treat heart conditions. In larger amounts, it causes cardiac arrhythmia and death. The victim would have experienced symptoms similar to a heart attack, but the poison would have taken effect gradually over several hours. Reed studied the photographs, pieces of the puzzle beginning to align. How long would someone have had to plan this? Digitalis isn't something you pick up at the local pharmacy. The killer would have needed to extract it from foxglove plants or obtain it from a medical source. This required premeditation, probably weeks or months of planning. Time of death? Based on liver temperature and rigor mortis, I'd estimate between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. last night, significantly earlier than when the body was discovered. Reed felt the case shift beneath his feet. Adrian's timeline was beginning to unravel. If Vivian died around midnight, his conference call alibi might not cover the crucial hours. One more thing, Detective. Dr. Chen led him to a microscope. I found traces of a sedative in her bloodstream, lorazepam. Someone wanted to ensure she couldn't fight back or call for help. Back at the station, Reed spread the evidence across his desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. Eleanor's financial irregularities, Dr. Chen's autopsy results, Adrian's two perfect alibis, and immediate deflection of suspicion onto others. His phone rang. Detective Reed, this is Judge Patricia Coleman. I understand my sister is dead, and I need to speak with you immediately. There are things about Adrian Cross you need to know. What kind of things, Judge Coleman? The kind that get people killed. Can you meet me at my chambers in an hour? And Detective, be very careful who you trust. Adrian Cross is the most dangerous man I've ever encountered, and I've seen plenty of criminals in my courtroom. As Reed hung up the phone, he realized the investigation was entering dangerous territory. Someone had planned Vivian Thorne's murder with meticulous care, using knowledge of both medicine and her personal habits to create the perfect crime. But perfect crimes, Reed knew, were often undone by imperfect criminals. The question now was whether Adrian Cross was as smart as he believed himself to be, or whether his confidence would become his downfall. Either way, Reed was determined to find out. The hunt for a killer had officially begun. Judge Patricia Coleman's chambers reflected the authority of someone who had spent decades weighing truth against deception. Law books lined every wall. There, leather spines bearing witness to countless legal battles, while afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows onto a desk where justice was served daily. But today, the usually composed judge looked shaken as she faced Detective Reed across her mahogany desk. "My sister called me 3 days ago," Patricia began, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "She said she'd discovered something about Adrian that would destroy him. She was scared, Detective. Vivian was never scared of anything." Reed leaned forward, sensing he was about to hear crucial testimony. "What kind of discovery?" "She wouldn't tell me over the phone, said it was too dangerous. We arranged to meet yesterday evening after her work, but she never showed up." Patricia's hands clenched into fists. "I should have insisted she go to the police immediately. Tell me about Adrian Cross. What's your history with him?" Patricia's expression darkened. "I've been a judge for 15 years. Detective, I've seen sociopaths, manipulators, con artists, but Adrian Cross is in a category by himself. He's a master at making people believe whatever serves his purpose." "You've had personal experience with him?" "When Vivian first partnered with him, I ran a background check. Not officially, you understand, but I have contacts." Patricia pulled a thick folder from her desk drawer. "Adrian Cross has been 3 different people over the past 20 years. Reed examined the documents she spread before him. Birth certificates, social security records, employment histories, all for different men with different names but bearing Adrian's photograph. Adrian Castellanos in Miami, where he embezzled $300,000 from a charity before disappearing. Andrew Crenshaw in Denver, who defrauded investors in a fake real estate scheme. And now Adrian Cross in California, the respectable tech entrepreneur." Patricia's voice grew harder with each revelation. "He's a professional identity thief, Detective, and my sister was his latest victim. Why didn't you tell her this earlier?" "I tried. God, how I tried. But Adrian had already worked his magic on her. He convinced Vivian that I was jealous of their success, that I was trying to sabotage their partnership out of spite." Patricia's voice broke slightly. "He's that good at manipulation. He turned my own sister against me." Reed studied the evidence, feeling the weight of the case settling on his shoulders. "This explains the financial irregularities Elena mentioned. It's worse than irregularities. According to my sources, Adrian has systematically embezzled nearly $10 million from Thorn Cross Technologies over the past 2 years. The acquisition deal was his exit strategy. He planned to take his share and disappear again, leaving Vivian to face the consequences. But something went wrong. Vivian discovered the truth. She was too smart and too thorough to be fooled forever." Patricia stood and walked to her window, gazing out at the courthouse steps where so many verdicts had been delivered. Adrian couldn't afford to let her expose him. He'd built the perfect identity here, the perfect reputation. Prison would have destroyed all of that. Reed's phone buzzed with a text message. Adrian Cross was requesting another meeting, claiming he had additional information about potential suspects. The timing felt too convenient, too orchestrated. "Judge Coleman, I need to ask, where were you last night between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m.? Patricia turned back to face him, understanding the necessity of the question. "At home, working on case files. My housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, can verify I never left the house. She brought me dinner around 9 p.m. and coffee at midnight when she saw my office light still on." An hour later, Reed sat across from Adrian Cross in the station's interview room. The polished businessman had somehow managed to look even more composed than during their first meeting, his suit immaculate, his silver hair perfectly styled. But Reed now saw the performance for what it was, a carefully constructed facade hiding something much darker. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Cross. I have some follow-up questions about your relationship with Ms. Thorne." "Of course, Detective. Anything I can do to help find who did this to her." Adrian's concern seemed genuine, his cooperation complete. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I remembered something that might be important." "What's that?" "Elena Vasquez had access to Vivian's home security system. She knew all the codes, had keys to every door. If someone wanted to make Vivian's death look natural, Elena would have had the perfect opportunity." Reed made notes, impressed despite himself by how smoothly Adrian deflected suspicion. "What about Judge Coleman? You mentioned tensions between the sisters." Patricia hated how success. She's always been jealous that Vivian built something significant while she remained a small-town judge. The acquisition deal represented everything Patricia could never achieve. Adrian leaned forward, his expression growing more intense. "Detective, I think Patricia convinced Elena to help her. They both had motives, Patricia's jealousy and Elena's job security fears. That's a serious accusation. I know it sounds far-fetched, but consider the facts. Elena had access and opportunity. Patricia had the legal knowledge to plan a perfect crime. Together, they could have orchestrated this entire thing." Reed watched Adrian weave his alternative theory with masterful precision. Every point connected logically. Every detail supported his narrative. If Reed hadn't seen Judge Coleman's evidence, he might have found Adrian's version convincing. "Mr. Cross, I need to ask about your financial relationship with Ms. Thorne. Were there any irregularities in company accounts?" For the first time, Adrian's composure flickered. It was barely perceptible, a slight tightening around his eyes, a momentary pause before responding. But Reed caught it. "Irregularities? I'm not sure what you mean. Our books are audited annually by one of the top accounting firms in the state. What about the escrow account Elena mentioned? Nearly $2 million in unexplained transfers." Adrian's recovery was swift and smooth. "Ah, yes. Those were perfectly legitimate transfers related to the acquisition preparations. Eleanor wouldn't have understood the complexity of such transactions. Her background is administrative, not financial. Can you provide documentation for these transfers?" "Absolutely. I'll have my attorney forward everything to you by tomorrow morning." Adrian stood, signaling the end of the interview. "Detective, I hope you'll consider the possibility that the people closest to Vivian might not be who they appear to be. In my experience, the greatest betrayals come from those we trust most." As Adrian left the station, Reed reflected on the man's extraordinary ability to make lies sound like truth. Every story was plausible, every explanation reasonable. Adrian Cross had transformed himself into the perfect witness, helpful, cooperative, and utterly convincing. But Reed had learned something crucial from this interview. Adrian Cross was worried about the financial investigation. His polished facade had cracked just enough to reveal the fear beneath, and frightened killers, Reed knew, often made fatal mistakes. The web of lies was beginning to unravel. Soon, Reed would discover just how far Adrian Cross was willing to go to protect his carefully constructed world. 3 days after Vivian Thorne's death, Detective Reed had assembled enough evidence to bring Adrian Cross in for formal questioning. The morning sun cast long shadows across the police station's interview room. As Reed reviewed his files one final time, financial records showing systematic embezzlement, Dr. Chen's autopsy confirming digitalis poisoning, Judge Coleman's background research revealing Adrian's pattern of identity theft and fraud. But Reed knew that circumstantial evidence wouldn't be enough to convict a master manipulator like Adrian Cross. He needed a confession, or better yet, a mistake that would expose the truth Adrian had killed to protect. Adrian entered the interview room with his characteristic confidence intact, accompanied by his attorney, a sharp-dressed woman who clearly specialized in defending white-collar criminals. Despite being officially arrested, Adrian appeared calm, almost serene, as if this were merely another business meeting to navigate. "Detective Reed," Adrian nodded respectfully as he took his seat. "I assume this is about the financial discrepancies you mentioned. I've brought all the documentation you requested." Reed spread the evidence across the table like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Bank statements showing the transferred funds, forged documents bearing Adrian's various aliases, witness statements from Eleanor and Judge Coleman, the medical examiner's report confirming murder. "Mr. Cross, we have evidence that you systematically embezzled nearly $10 million from Thorne Cross Technologies over the past 2 years." Adrian examined the documents with the careful attention of someone well-versed in financial manipulation. "Detective, I can explain every one of these transactions. Vivian and I were partners. We made all major financial decisions together, including the decision to poison her with digitalis." "That's a serious accusation," Adrian's attorney interjected, but Adrian himself remained unnaturally calm. "Detective, you're looking at a grieving business partner and seeing a criminal. I would never harm Vivian." Reed pulled out copies of the background investigation Judge Coleman had conducted. "Tell me about Adrian Castellanos and Andrew Crenshaw and whoever you were before that." For the first time since Reed had met him, Adrian Cross appeared genuinely surprised. He studied the documents in silence, his silver hair catching the fluorescent light as he processed this unexpected development. "Impressive detective work," Adrian finally said, his voice carrying a note of admiration. though I'm afraid those documents don't prove anything about Vivian's death. They establish a pattern of fraud and identity theft spanning 2 decades. They establish that I've reinvented myself several times, yes, but that's not illegal, Detective. People change their names, their locations, their lives. It doesn't make them murderers. Reed leaned back, studying Adrian's face. Even confronted with overwhelming evidence of his past crimes, the man remained composed, rational, almost philosophical about his exposure. This level of control was unnatural and revealing. Let's talk about the night Vivian died. You claim you were home preparing for the presentation, on conference calls until midnight. That's correct. I have phone records to prove it. Dr. Chen estimates Vivian died between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Your conference call ended at 11:47 p.m., giving you plenty of time to drive to her house. Adrian's attorney whispered something in his ear, but he waved her off. Detective, even if I had driven to Vivian's house after my call, which I didn't, how would I have gotten inside? The house was secured and I don't have keys. Elena Vasquez had keys. You could have convinced her to help you. Elena was trying to sabotage our acquisition. Why would she help me? Because you promised her something. Money, job security, or maybe you threatened her. Adrian shook his head, his expression almost pitying. Detective, you're creating elaborate conspiracy theories when the truth is much simpler. Vivian died of natural causes, possibly stress-induced cardiac arrest. Everything else is coincidence and misinterpretation. Reed felt his frustration building. Adrian had an answer for everything, a rational explanation that deflected every accusation, but Reed had one more card to play, the detail that had been bothering him since the crime scene. Mr. Cross, when you found Vivian's body, you mentioned checking for a pulse. Did you move her at all? No, I was very careful not to disturb anything. Did you speak to her? Sometimes people talk to victims even when they know they're gone. Adrian considered this carefully. I may have said something. It was a very emotional moment. What did you say? I don't remember exactly. Probably just I'm sorry or something similar. Reed nodded sympathetically. It must have been terrible, finding someone you cared about like that. Did she look peaceful? Yes, actually. She looked almost serene, like she had simply fallen asleep at her desk. No signs of distress or struggle? None at all. I remember thinking how fortunate it was that she didn't suffer. Reed leaned forward, his voice becoming conversational, almost friendly. It's interesting that you mention her looking peaceful. Most people who die of sudden cardiac arrest show signs of distress, facial contortion, evidence of pain or struggle. Perhaps her death wasn't as sudden as we assumed. You know, that's exactly what Dr. Chen concluded. He determined that the digitalis poisoning would have taken effect gradually, over several hours. Vivian would have felt increasingly drowsy, eventually losing consciousness before her heart stopped. Adrian nodded thoughtfully. That would explain why she looked so peaceful. The interesting thing is, she was found with her head resting on her papers, as if she had simply dozed off while working. But Dr. Chen found evidence that she was moved after death. Moved? Someone arranged her body to look natural, positioned her head just so, made sure her reading glasses were neatly folded beside her laptop. Reed watched Adrian's face carefully. It was very thoughtful, really, almost like someone who cared about her, wanted her to look dignified in death. Adrian's expression grew distant, and for a moment, something resembling genuine emotion flickered across his features. She was a remarkable woman. She deserved dignity. I agree. Tell me, when you found her, did she look exactly as you described? Head resting peacefully on her papers? Yes, exactly as I described. Reed pulled out a crime scene photograph and placed it in front of Adrian. This is how Vivian appeared when the first officers arrived. Notice anything? Adrian studied the photograph, his brow furrowing slightly. It looks exactly as I remember. Look closer at her position. Her head is resting on specific documents. The acquisition contracts you both had been reviewing. Yes, she was working on those when she died. Reed felt his pulse quicken. This was the moment he'd been building toward. Mr. Cross, those acquisition contracts weren't delivered to Vivian's house until 1:30 a.m., nearly 2 hours after Dr. Chen estimates she died. The silence in the interview room was deafening. Adrian stared at the photograph, his composed facade finally beginning to crack. His attorney grabbed his arm, but he seemed oblivious to her presence. That's impossible, Adrian whispered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Reed pressed his advantage. The delivery company has electronic confirmation that the contracts were delivered at 1:30 a.m. via emergency courier service. You authorized and paid for that delivery yourself, Mr. Cross. The question is, why did you need those contracts delivered after Vivian was already dead? Adrian's mind raced, trying to construct another plausible explanation, but for the first time in the investigation, he appeared genuinely rattled. The timing must be wrong. Vivian had those contracts before I left her that evening. No, she didn't. I've checked with the legal team. The final version wasn't completed until 1 a.m. You needed those contracts to sell your story about finding her working late. This is all speculation, Detective. Reed leaned back, studying Adrian's face. The master manipulator was finally showing cracks in his armor, but Reed needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed Adrian to make a mistake, a fatal slip that would expose the truth. You know what I find most interesting about your story, Mr. Cross? It's how perfectly it all fits together. The unlocked door, Vivian working late, the peaceful death scene. It's almost like someone planned every detail. Adrian straightened in his chair, some of his composure returning. Sometimes life is just tragic, Detective. Not everything is a conspiracy. You're right. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Reed paused, then delivered his final gambit. Tell me, when you found Vivian, what were her last words? The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Adrian's attorney started to object, but Adrian raised his hand to silence her. His eyes grew distant, and for a moment, genuine grief seemed to wash over his features. She said she forgave me. The words escaped Adrian's lips before he could stop them, spoken with such raw emotion that they carried the weight of absolute truth. But as soon as he realized what he'd said, horror flashed across his face. Reed felt his heart racing. She forgave you? For what, Mr. Cross? I meant theoretically. If she had lived long enough to speak, I imagine she would have forgiven whoever did this to her. Vivian was compassionate that way, but it was too late. The damage was done. Adrian Cross, the master of lies and manipulation, had just revealed knowledge he couldn't possibly possess, unless he had been present during Vivian's final moments. Mr. Cross, Dr. Chen's autopsy showed that the digitalis poisoning would have rendered Vivian unconscious for hours before her death. She wouldn't have been able to speak to anyone. Adrian stared at Reed in silence, finally understanding the trap he'd walked into. His silver hair caught the harsh fluorescent light as he sat frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The only way you could know Vivian's last words, Reed continued relentlessly, is if you were there when you poisoned her, if you stayed with her as the digitalis took effect, arranging the scene, waiting for her to die. Adrian's attorney was frantically whispering in his ear, but Adrian seemed to have withdrawn into himself. The mask of respectability had finally slipped away, revealing the cold calculation beneath. She discovered everything, didn't she? Reed pressed. The embezzlement, your false identities, your plan to disappear with the acquisition money. She confronted you, and you realized your perfect life was about to be destroyed. For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then, with the calm demeanor of a man who had finally been beaten at his own game, he looked directly at Reed. She was going to destroy me, he said quietly. Everything I'd built, everything I'd worked for, 7 years of careful planning, and she was going to tear it all down in a single phone call to the FBI. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Adrian Cross, the man who had lied as naturally as breathing, had finally told the truth. The confession transformed the sterile interview room into a theater of justice. Adrian Cross sat in stunned silence, staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. The silver-haired businessman who had manipulated his way through life for decades had finally been undone by 7 simple words. She said she forgave me. Detective Reed leaned forward, knowing he needed to capture every detail while Adrian was still in this vulnerable state. Tell me exactly what happened that night, Mr. Cross. Adrian's attorney made one final attempt to silence her client, but Adrian waved her away with the resignation of a man who had exhausted all his options. When he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual calculated charm. I went to see Vivian around 10 p.m. She had called me earlier that evening, said she'd discovered some irregularities in our accounts and wanted to discuss them privately. Adrian's laugh was bitter, self-deprecating. She used that word, irregularities, as if $10 million in embezzlement was simply a bookkeeping error. How did you get into the house? Vivian let me in. She was still in her office, surrounded by printouts of bank statements, transaction records, everything I'd been so careful to hide. Adrian's eyes grew distant. She looked at me with such disappointment, Detective. Not anger, disappointment. That was somehow worse. Reed made careful notes, aware that this confession would be crucial evidence in court. What did she say to you? She asked me why I'd stolen from our company, why I'd betrayed her trust, why I'd built our entire partnership on lies. Adrian's composure cracked slightly. She said she'd given me everything, her trust, her friendship, her loyalty, and I'd repaid her with deception. Did you try to explain? I tried to convince her that I could pay it back, that we could handle this quietly without involving the authorities. But she was too ethical for that. She said she had no choice but to turn me in. Adrian met Reed's eyes. She was going to call the FBI in the morning. Reed could see the scene unfolding in his mind. The confrontation between the brilliant entrepreneur and her duplicitous partner. Trust shattering like glass in the elegant Carmel mansion. When did you decide to kill her? I didn't plan it, not initially. I brought the digitalis as insurance, thinking maybe I could threaten her with suicide if she didn't listen to reason. But when I realized she wouldn't be swayed, Adrian's voice trailed off. You'd obtained the digitalis beforehand? 2 weeks earlier. I have a contact in Mexico who supplies certain specialized medications. I'd been carrying it with me. Ever since I suspected Vivian was getting close to the truth, Adrian's admission revealed the cold calculation behind his desperate act. I told myself it was just a precaution. How did you administer it? Adrian was quiet for a long moment, lost in the memory of that fatal night. I put it in the coffee I brought her, Ethiopian blend from that little shop she loved downtown. She always worked late with coffee. It was part of her routine. The detail struck Reed as particularly cruel, using Vivian's own habits against her, turning a simple pleasure into the instrument of her death. Did she realize what was happening? Not at first. The digitalis took effect gradually. Just as your medical examiner said, she became drowsy, complained of feeling lightheaded. I told her it was stress from the confrontation. Adrian's voice grew quieter. I stayed with her as the poison worked. She kept trying to discuss solutions, ways we could resolve the situation legally. Even as she was dying, she was trying to save me. Reed felt a chill at the image of Vivian Thorne spending her final hours in the company of her killer, unaware that her trusted partner had already sealed her fate. What were her actual last words? Adrian closed his eyes, and for the first time since Reed had met him, the man appeared genuinely vulnerable. She said she forgave me. Even after she realized what I'd done, in those final conscious moments, she said she understood why I felt trapped, and that she forgave me for it. The profound tragedy of those words hung heavy in the interview room. Vivian Thorne had died as she had lived, with compassion and dignity, even for the man who had betrayed and murdered her. Then what happened? I waited until she was gone, then arranged the scene, positioned her at the desk, made sure everything looked natural. I'd already planned the story about finding her in the morning, the early meeting, the unlocked door, checking for a pulse. Adrian's voice grew mechanical as he described the calculated staging of the crime scene. Why the acquisition contracts? I needed something to explain why she'd been working so late. The contracts provided the perfect justification. I called our courier service and had them delivered, then placed them under her head, to make it look like she'd been reviewing them when she collapsed. Reed marveled at the cold precision of Adrian's plan. Every detail had been calculated to create the perfect natural death, from the locked office to the coffee cup positioned exactly on its coaster. Mr. Cross, in all your years of deception and fraud, did you ever imagine it would end like this? Adrian looked up, and Reed saw something he hadn't expected: genuine remorse. I told myself I was protecting what we'd built together, the company, the jobs we'd created, the innovation we were bringing to the world. But the truth is, Detective, I was protecting myself, my reputation, my lifestyle, my freedom, and Vivian paid the price. Vivian paid the price for trusting me, for believing that the man she partnered with actually existed. Adrian's voice broke slightly. Adrian Cross was just another lie, Detective, another identity I created to get what I wanted. But Vivian saw him as real, treated him as real. She loved a man who never existed. As Reed wrapped up the confession, he reflected on the profound tragedy of the case. Vivian Thorne had been killed not by a stranger or a random criminal, but by the person she trusted most, a man who had spent years perfecting the art of deception until he could no longer distinguish between his lies and reality. Adrian Cross would spend the rest of his life in prison, his carefully constructed identities finally stripped away to reveal the hollow manipulator beneath. But justice for Vivian Thorne felt incomplete, tainted by the knowledge that her faith in human goodness had been weaponized against her. As Adrian was led away in handcuffs, Reed couldn't shake the image of Vivian's final moments. A brilliant woman dying alone with her killer, offering forgiveness, even as her life ebbed away. It was that forgiveness, spoken in trust and innocence, that had ultimately exposed the truth and brought justice to her murderer. Sometimes, Reed realized, the most profound victories came at the highest cost. Adrian Cross had been caught not by superior detective work or forensic evidence, but by the very compassion he had exploited and destroyed. In trying to use Vivian's final words to humanize himself, he had instead revealed the depth of his betrayal. The case was closed, but its impact would linger. In the quiet coastal town of Carmel by the Sea, where million-dollar homes still overlooked the Pacific, justice had been served. But the price of that justice was a reminder that the greatest dangers often came from those we trusted most. Adrian Cross, the master of lies, had finally told one truth too many.